Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here and studying this subject. I think that's the most important thing because we are here as academics, but don't forget why we do this. That's the key questions, right? Why are we doing this? So for me, it's a pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker. It's Kadri Aavik. I know that you had the program, but I think it's good to refresh the idea. So Dr. Aavik works as Associate Professor of Gender Studies in the School of Governance, Law, and Society in Tallinn University. From 2018 to 2022, she conducted postdoctoral research at the Gender Study Unit at the University of Helsinki. She works in Society of Gender, which is a focus in critical studies of men and masculinity, critical animal studies, and vegan studies, and their intersections. She coordinates the activity of the Gender Study Research Group at Tallinn University, and her publications have appeared in journals such as American Journal of Men's Health, Humanities, and Social Science, Communication, and Health. She is the author of Contesting Anthropocentric Masculinities Through Veganism, Lived Experience of Vegan Men, and co-editor of Feminist, Animal, and Multi-Species Studies, Critical Perspective on Food and Eating. So her presentation, her talk, is called Examining Institutional Violence Towards Non-Human Animals, the Case of European Union Schools Milk Subsidy. So, Kadri, the floor is yours.
Okay, just opening this up here, see it. Thank you so much, first of all, Nuria and all the organizing team for organizing this really amazing, really fascinating conference. And thank you, Estela, for your kind introduction. I think I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes maximum, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. And I'm very happy to be here, so thank you so much for inviting me. It's such an honor to be speaking here. I think I'll just start my timer in case. All right, checking this out. This work. If I want to change the slides, is there? Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, for some reason. Technical difficulties. Sorry. Okay. No. Nope. If I'm doing something wrong. I guess I'll start, and then while it's being fixed, not to lose time. The work I'm going to present today, I'll talk about, it's sort of ongoing and unpublished. So I'm currently in the process of writing a book on actually vegan parenting. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll test it now. Yeah, it works. Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm doing research, and I'm in the process of writing a book on vegan parenting, drawing on interviews with vegan parents. But in this presentation, I'll focus more on the broader structural context in which we practice veganism, and some of us practice vegan parenting, and how this context really can enable or hinder our veganism on the individual level. So I think it's really important to look at institutions, and particularly institutional violence towards non-human animals. So I draw on actual, also personal experience. I've been a vegan for almost 20 years and a parent for 4 years, a bit more than 4 years. So my son Sylvan is sitting here in the first row as well. Okay. The focus today is really then to examine the role of institutions in supporting veganism, and the transition to a plant-based food system as a more ethical and sustainable way of relating to other animals and the entire planet, actually. And it's important to look at sort of some entanglements on the institutional level, how institutional speciesism is really linked to capitalist interests in the animal-industrial complex. And so I'll be also looking at the EU agricultural policy and subsidies, because this milk scheme that I'm going to be mentioning and talking about is part of these EU subsidies. And then the education system is a really important institution there that is tied up, and it's actually part of the animal-industrial complex. And then there will be a small part where I illustrate the implications of these entanglements in everyday settings. And this is where I draw on a little bit on my own experience, as well as the interviews that I've done with vegan parents in Estonia, where I'm based. So I'll be bringing together several themes, kind of talking about anthropocentric institutions and how this institutional setup plays out in the micro level. And it's really important, I think, to ask, who and how bears the consequences of institutional failures, because that's what I would really call them. And because I'm also a gender scholar, I'll bring in sort of gender and intersectional perspectives where I think they are important. So the outline is sort of like this. First, I'll be talking a little bit about anthropocentric institutions and institutional violence against animals, and then specifically about the education system, although there are others who've done that work in much more detail, and I'll be referring to their work. And then we'll look at the EU, sort of like what are some of the climate commitments, and how they support animal agriculture. And then I'll tell you a little bit about that EU school fruit, vegetable and milk scheme. That's kind of the focus, and how that plays out when the member states in actual educational institutions, and then end with some conclusions and possibly ways forward. So there have been, for instance, the sociologist and critical animal studies scholar David Nybert has talked about anthropocentric institutions that he also calls speciesist institutions, and how basically the exploitation of other animals is deeply embedded in our social institutions. And maybe just a note, because I think sociologists talk a lot about social institutions, and not everybody is a sociologist. So they sort of, when I'm talking about institutions, I mean more structured forms of human activity, organized set of beliefs and behaviors, but also institutions can and do consist of organizations. So for instance, the education system is an institution, and specific schools as part of it are organizations, and the EU itself is a transnational organization, and also we can think of capitalism as a social institution, but it also consists of organizations, so it's a little bit of a mix, and maybe the boundaries between institution and organization are not always clear. But basically, when we talk about speciesist and anthropocentric institutions, I mean that the states, industry, the education system, medicine, they are either directly using non-human animals or they're relying on their use. And as part of this, this is what critical animal studies scholars in education have pointed out, is that we have this process called anthropocentric socialization, where children are raised according to the idea that humans should dominate over nature and other animals. And I would also point out Richard Twine's book. I really recommend it, The Climate Crisis and Other Animals, where he talks about the slaughterhouse as a kind of cultural secret which is concealed from children, and it serves to protect childhood innocence and adults from shame, but it is gradually revealed. It's a secret that is revealed through teaching children different functions of animal species, and finally the message is that non-human animals are resources to us and their exploitation is normalized. So yeah, that's sort of like one way in which that speciesist socialization works. But yeah, just to sort of reiterate that, I think when we talk about a vegan transition and a plant-based transition, and they are not the same things, because obviously veganism is so much more than just food. But then the role of institutions in both of these is of key importance, because institutions can either enable or hinder moving towards more ethical and sustainable human-animal relations and food systems. And obviously, in the current climate breakdown, their role is of key importance. And we know, and Richard Twine in his book has really outlined this very well, how the climate crisis is driven in large part by our exploitation of other animals. So that's why I think that we should, I think we often pay attention on the sort of micro level and the practices of individual vegans and their identities, which is obviously really important, but sometimes maybe attention to these institutions that shape and enable or hinder our individual practices is also really important. And yeah, so when we look at institutions, and so what do they do then? How do they either enable or hinder our efforts to practice veganism or to move towards plant-based diets? So that has been studied, and I myself have done a little bit of that work. And definitely we can say that institutional violence against animals is normalized, it's everywhere, and it is concealed. It is not framed as violence. So when in accounts of any mainstream account of violence, we don't see violence against animals as mentioned as a kind of type of violence, because it is just a norm. It's just an everyday practice. And there are a couple of other important places, I think. In my own research, I have looked at national nutrition recommendations, which looks like, yeah, it's sort of not really seen as a place where we could look for where's the violence against animals, but the way the eating of animals is normalized in these policies and documents, and how it is depicted is really notable. So, for instance, I analyzed the Estonian nutrition recommendations, where animals are talked about as high-quality protein and cow's milk as essential. And I think we encounter this in the national nutrition recommendations of many countries. And also the healthcare system is an important site which we could examine when we want to see, like, you know, how violence against animals is played out. And so vegans have been constructed as deviant in medical encounters, is something that I have also found. And the education system, which I will get to in a minute in a bit more detail. Right, and so I want to kind of like look at now what's the role of capitalism in all this, because also when we look at these EU subsidies and policies then around animal food, then it has a really important role. So capitalism as an institution relies on the exploitation and commodification of human and non-human life, so both of these, and they are sort of it's intersectional, so it's all entangled, as David Nybart has pointed out. Basically, Richard Twine also says, he says systemic animal exploitation is intersectional, and it is historically inseparable from and enabled by the development of capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism. So all these systems are really interlinked very much. As many of you know, he has talked about and developed the concept of the animal industrial complex as a set of institutions supporting capitalism and animal oppression, which he says defining the animal industrial complex, which it's a partly opaque and multiple set of networks and relationships between the corporate sector, governments, and public and private science. So definitely when we look at what goes on the EU level, the subsidies and the milk scheme that I'm going to talk about, it's really part of that animal industrial complex, and we can really see the entanglement of these different interests and capitalism, capitalist interests with sort of what governments are doing and scientists as well. There's also examples, quite notable examples. For instance, scientists and animal agriculture corporations and the whole sector are very much entangled and collaborating. There's such a document as the Dublin Declaration, which is sort of presented as very, in a way, neutral science work, which actually represents the interests of the meat industry, and it presents sort of evidence or relies on evidence that meat production and consumption is really important and is central to our societies. And there's also critique of that a document from critical animal studies perspectives. I have a few references here. And this document, in fact, has already influenced EU policies. Yeah, so it comes across as a very sort of powerful document, and particularly that it is presented and it is combined, it is written by scientists, makes it legitimate, sort of. As we also know that there are these ag laws, in many countries since the early 1990s, that we're not allowed to, animal activists cannot really get access to these industry sort of spaces where animals are abused on a routine basis. So this is also like capitalism here intersecting with legal frameworks where animal abuse is prevented from being documented. So these are just a couple of examples of these entanglements. Yes, and definitely here I bring in gender somehow, because I think that's really important. So as I just talked about institutions being speciesist, but they also gendered very much. And this, for instance, they definitely operate according to certain norms and values, and they are seemingly neutral, but definitely there are certain worldviews and interests that they support. And gender scholars have talked about that quite extensively. And because I'm also a scholar working in critical studies of men and masculinities, when I look at, examine, institutions and organizations, I think masculinity plays a really central role. For instance, when we think of how governments are organized and policymaking, first of all, who are the people who are in these spaces, who are leading these activities. So basically, governments and organizations that regulate and subsidize the animal industry are led overwhelmingly by privileged men. And also, when you look up actually statistics, you see that the world's largest animal industries are owned and managed by men. So we could really ask, whose interests do policies promoting the production and consumption of farmed animals serve? And I would say mostly the interest of privileged human beings, especially white middle-class men in the global north, who have been the key drivers of capitalism and colonialism, as well as climate change. So always, it's, I think, important to keep that in mind when examining what institutions do and what they enable us to do. Okay, so now I'm gonna kind of talk about the education system a little bit, while not being an expert really in that field, but I think these insights are really important because the school milk scheme really is played out, really is happening in the education system. So this institution is both anthropocentric as well as gendered. So scholars like critical animal scholar Helena Pedersen and others have talked about the hidden curriculum, by which they mean tacitly communicated messages about non-human animals and non-human animal relations, where the instrumentalization of other animals is depicted as normal, natural, inevitable. So that's the sort of messages that children get through this hidden curriculum. And for instance, where we can see it manifested is food in schools and daycares, animals just being eaten there, as well as animal experimentation in, for instance, science and universities, as well as textbooks in education. And at the same time, as schools, are speciesist, they're also gendered. They reinforce very much gender dichotomies, masculinity. So as we know, the school is a very hierarchical organization, and there are certain systems of discipline at place. But at the same time, it's kind of curious that there's a feminized workforce carrying out at the same time gendered and speciesist socialization. So this picture, you might be wondering where that is from. This is actually from my son's daycare, yes? So there's it was quite short notice that we learned that there's going to be an educational, what was called an educational program coming to the daycare where children were supposedly being taught about wild animals or just how animals live, and that was all that was said. And then it actually turned out on closer inspection that there was this woman from a Women Hunters Association coming to the daycare and introducing then, basically she had with her these body parts of dead animals that she exhibited, and the children were able to play with them or look at them. And so that sort of happened, and it didn't really receive any backlash. And so basically, yeah, we you know, that's a thing, because, you know, as vegans and animal advocates, then we personally didn't take our son to the daycare that morning, and I wrote to the director about this, and she just responded to me, noted, nothing else. And it's really like, this is something that's quite normalized, and it didn't really receive any criticism. Nobody really challenged it except us, who are, I think, the only vegan family in that daycare. So yes, so that's one of the kind of examples of the hidden curriculum in educational institutions. Okay, and of course there are challenges to this kind of speciesist socialization and education. And for instance, there's a field of research called critical animal pedagogy. And there's also post-anthropocentric pedagogy, and as well as vegan education that really challenge this kind of way of thinking about other animals and using them in educational institutions, in education. So basically challenging human domination over other animals through education, and it aims to liberate other animals, and there's various ways that it does it. So maybe I'm not going to go into detail, but yeah, it's sort of like really rethinking the human. And I would also note here that an intersectional perspective is very important here. Basically paying attention to analyzing how the abuse of non-human animals is linked to the exploitation of different human groups. And also just as a couple of initiatives, this is from higher education, so initiatives to contest animal-based catering in the education system. This is almost 10 years ago that Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and other colleagues from Critical Animal Studies wrote this text called A Sustainable Campus, the Sydney Declaration of Interspecies Sustainability, basically arguing for universities to really adopt, you know, plant-based catering in their campuses, and the importance of this and the role of universities in promoting a different kind of relationship to other animals. And just recently I saw this campaign, students, sort of student initiative as making universities plant-based. So these are all in higher education, and then probably in different countries there are interventions on different levels. I think in some ways maybe it's more difficult to do this in sort of daycares and early childhood education for different reasons that I'm gonna mention later. But yeah, so I think there are some good and promising examples also in that area. Okay, and now next what I want to do is really now to turn my eye to the EU and to kind of get to that milk scheme. So this was more like a background, but so what does the EU do? What do they say they do? And what are their policies? So their climate commitments. So as we know, there's the European Green Deal, and this is very ambitious. Europe wants to be, according to this document, the first climate neutral continent. That would mean that there would be no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050. And there's also the Paris Climate Agreement, which is signed by all EU member states. Again, so becoming the first climate neutral economy and society by 2050. And there's that aim to keep the increase in global average temperature below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and also actually to make efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. So as we know, there's already evidence that this can't really be achieved, but these are the commitments there. Okay, but then let's look at then what else they do, you know? So these are quite ambitious climate commitments. The EU does not talk about really animal ethics. That's not their thing, but they talk a lot about climate. So we can look at that. The EU has got this agricultural policy, CAP, so it has subsidies and talk about them in a minute. And also I want to see, look at the role of capitalism in this. Basically, when looking at the EU's budget and subsidies, 1/3 of the EU's entire budget goes to agricultural subsidies. And within this, 4 times more money is going to animal farming than growing plants. So this is really staggering and really significant. So this CAP, the agricultural policy, these objectives, they do not include a transition to a plant-based diet or even a reduction in animal products in diets. So animal farming is depicted as sustainable and compatible with climate goals. So the EU doesn't see contradictions. And definitely when looking closely at these documents, we see that these goals are enmeshed with capitalist expansion, ideas about this. So for instance, we can see text like productivity increases per animal or per unit of land in a sustainable way, could be envisaged. So we sort of they want to increase productivity here. Talking a lot about sustainability. And of course, sustainability is such a vague term, and it is misused a lot, or used in a vague way. So a lot of things can be placed under sustainability in that discourse quite uncritically, I would think. And further, so basically what the EU is doing is they are promoting this sort of green growth, yeah? What I would argue, the way they approach this is that they want to try to find capitalist technofixes to quite fundamental problems. So this is, again, from these agricultural policy documents. So they say that new technologies facilitate the production of more with less. So they want to produce more, they want to increase their production, but with fewer resources to be more sustainable. Also, there's this idea of what they call farming 4.0, which refers to the technological revolution characterizing the modern farming sector based on the extensive exchange of digital technologies, smart farming, knowledge-based production methods. So basically, as you see, this is very much embedded also and linked to this whole new discourse of technological development, also AI. Although I didn't see that quite there in the documents, but it's probably coming up more and more. And I would think, again, linking this to gender, masculinities, and power relations more broadly. So this sort of displays a certain kind of techno-optimism and really speaks of some techno-fixes and ideas of technological escapism. So there's this they really want to support economic growth and capitalist expansion, but do not address the core issues that have led to the ecological crisis in the first place. And several critical masculinity scholars have talked about this kind of way of thinking as kind of exhibiting technological and ecomodern masculinities. Again, like using these techno-fixes to try to superficially do something, but not really fixing the very fundamental problems. And as scholars of degrowth and other critical scholars have noted, actually green growth and sort of what is called green capitalism, they're not possible. It's just not like a feasible reality for different reasons. Adrian Buller's book, Value of the Whale, I think it was called, is really insightful. I would recommend that. All right, and so now with all this background and seeing what the EU is doing and that we have these species as institutions, what is that milk scheme? We'll look at that now. Yes, so there will be a lot to analyze here, so I'm going to give you just a glimpse into this. And if somebody did maybe a more in-depth, like visual or discourse analysis of it, that would be extremely interesting here. That's a picture from how the EU basically represents it. So this is again a case of the entanglement of institutional speciesism and capitalism. So basically that scheme means that the EU allocates money, funds, to fruit, vegetables and cow's milk in the education systems of the member states on basically from preschool levels to secondary school. And the European Commission says that this scheme also supports educational measures, and this can include lessons, but it can also help fund farm visits, school gardens, tasting and cooking workshops, theme days and games. The objective is to reconnect children to agriculture and teach them about healthy eating habits. Issues such as local food chains, organic farming, sustainable production of food waste may also be covered. So that's the sort of, these are the broad objectives of the scheme. But cow's milk is a really important component in that scheme. And the whole scheme has quite a substantial budget. Over 220 million euros per school year is allocated to that scheme. And an interesting fact, so still a few years ago, the cow's milk scheme used to be separate from the fruit and vegetable scheme, but they were combined. I do not know the exact reasons, but for me, one sort of what it does actually, what it does is it helps to greenwash cow's milk, I would think, because if you combine it with fruits and vegetables, you can present it as more healthy and more sustainable, I think. So that's sort of one thing. And definitely this is a case of institutional violence against animals. But what is so what is important here is that it's so hidden, and the way how this cow's milk is normalized. Here, I'll have examples about that. And then how is that scheme implemented in the EU member states? So each country actually can decide how much they allocate to fruit and vegetables and milk. Since, you know, these things are combined, the EU has given some liberties to its member states. And when I looked up, there are 8 member states, including Estonia, that have chosen to allocate, in some cases, significantly more to cow's milk. Yeah, so there's basically, this is just the bulk of it basically goes to cow's milk. And national strategies, which are in every EU member state, it's compulsory for the states to have them. They include the aim of increasing children's milk consumption, and the target that they want basically school children to be drinking cow's milk every day in the school, in educational institutions. So that's the target. So, and of course the dairy industry, yeah, to come to this role of capitalism, the dairy industry, so that their role is significant here. And for instance, there's the European Dairy Association, which does a lot of effort to greenwash cow's milk. So they've got these campaigns here, which, for instance, they talk about recent studies without references, though, on that page. Recent studies have shown that dairy products have a low climate impact when balanced against the nutritional importance in a healthy diet. So a lot of it is also like, they might say that, okay, maybe these products might have a bit bigger impact on the environment than plant-based products, but we need to take into account the nutritional value. So that's what they very much emphasize. They say the European dairy industry fully endorses and supports animal welfare. So that's another discourse that they are producing. Yeah, so there's another text here, and I found it really interesting. They talk about the European lactosphere. I didn't find this word anywhere else, but in this dairy industry documents, the lactosphere. It has got some interesting connotations that could be analyzed probably further, right? And And in the dairy industry, both transnationally and locally in member states, is conducting all sorts of campaigns. And I think this is from the UK, although I wasn't so sure when I analyzed, when I looked at that page, but it appeared to be. And there are fun things you can do there, like nominate your milk hero. Here, something for schools, a campaign. And basically, this is called coolmilk.com campaign. And they say, our journey began with a simple yet profound belief. Every child deserves access to nutritious milk, regardless of their background or circumstances. Yeah, so this is like framed as something that children deserve, and if they're deprived of it, that's almost like a violation of the children's rights in a way. But actual impact of the dairy industry, and it's surprisingly hard to find when I went and did some research. The first figure here, which says that 4% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas production is from the dairy milk industry. I think this is quite a conservative estimate, probably because this data comes from the dairy industry. Well, it's sort of, I think it's a journal of like milk science, or dairy milk science, so we can think that it would be good to have some other figure as well to compare, but that's what I was able to find. But this is just a graph here of different environmental impacts of dairy versus plant milks, and you can see the blue lines on top are dairy milk, and the others are plant-based milks, and they have got significantly lower environmental impacts. And quite recently, and this is about the whole sort of animal-based food system. I found this information which was presented. It's just the same information that we actually have, but it was really, the way it was framed was really striking. Basically, halting climate breakdown is impossible without moving beyond animal-centric food systems. And there are quite prominent studies here that say that. And obviously, to this audience, I don't need to explain that, but it's actually something that is really hard. If you present it this way, it's really hard for many people to believe. I recently submitted a manuscript to a journal, and using my critical animal studies approach, and I had this sentence there with these references, and one of the reviewers said that it might be true, but it's really hard to believe, and it's too contentious to be presented as a fact. That's literally what the reviewer said. So basically, it's really hard for people to accept it, and I think it's a case of willful ignorance, obviously, as well. Yeah, and also, finally, we could, of course, critique this whole discourse from many perspectives, and the feminist, critical race, and decolonial perspectives on the milk industry are really important, and the milk industry has been critiqued from these perspectives already. So, basically, ecofeminists have pointed out how cow's milk is produced by female mammals, and they have got kind of specific kind of suffering related to that in the dairy industry. Already historically, claims of racial superiority have been used in cow's milk promotion in the US, let's say in the 1920s and 1930s. Research like by Vasilis Stănescu and some others have looked at how some contemporary far-right groups have constructed cow's milk as superior food and associated it with racial purity and idealized versions of masculinity. Also, we know that lactose tolerance, so the people who can tolerate lactose, this is linked to whiteness. So cow's milk consumption has been linked to American identity, to a progress narrative. I have a quote here: the perfect whiteness of this food and the white body genetically capable of digesting it. So it's all linked to that. There's a field called feminist post-colonial milk studies, which I think is quite important. Greta Gard, an ecofeminist, has done some of that work and developed that field. And for instance, she's talked about Nestle, a huge international corporation, and their powdered milk campaign in Africa and India, really to use this cow's milk sort of replacement formula for breast milk, and all the implications of this, colonialist implications in Africa and India. Of course, Greta Gard and others have also talked about the embodied experiences of dairy cows and the distress and grief of cows and calves being forcibly separated. So there's a lot to unpack here. And well, thinking of this whole EU sort of milk subsidies and school scheme, this is implicated in these very problematic issues. And this is, of course, left quite unexamined. And the EU doesn't take these perspectives, obviously. And now sort of coming to this part where I want to look at a little bit at what are some everyday implications of all this. So I introduced to you the institutional context, institutional speciesism, and how it's entangled with capitalism, and then how does it shape our vegan practices, let's say vegan parenting in educational institutions. So, actually, in my study of vegan parents, I interviewed vegan parents who had children in different levels of the education system, but the daycare or kindergarten, preschool level is, I think, really important. And I think this was for them like a site where it was typical to experience difficulties or most like sort of very specific issues as well. And one thing is that the daycare sort of resembles more like a total institution. There's a very high level of institutional control. Typically, children spend long days there, even longer than in high school, secondary school. There's a lack of choices regarding these daily routines there, and children at that age are typically not so capable yet of challenging anthropocentric education. And also they get several meals per day, and this is maybe particular to some countries like in Estonia, where children get 3 meals per day when they're in daycare. And this is some of the kind of experiences of vegan parents that they specifically say about cow's milk in daycares, in Estonian daycares. And a mother of 3 children says that the most shocking thing for me about the kindergarten menu is the excessive amount of cow's milk. It's totally not normal. They serve it for breakfast, for lunch. There's so much of it, terribly much. And also like another mother who works also as a kindergarten teacher says that they teach children that cows give us milk, and there are some puzzles and other things that convey this message, and it's very difficult to be the only vegan there and to say something about this or to explain it to others. And I want to share like a few personal experiences now. So I've taken, this is a typical public daycare weekly menu in Estonia. And this is one of the menus, weekly menus of my child's kindergarten. And this is just happens to be from last year, in a week in September, but they all tend to be like that pretty much. And here I've highlighted with purple the foods that contain cow's milk. The different kinds. And with the pink, it's meat, animal flesh, basically, is in these foods. And you see how there's sort of breakfast, there's lunch, and there's pre-dinner, something like that. Yeah, there are a couple of, in that week, there's at least 3 instances of where they, or 4 actually, where they give kids cow's milk just to drink, in addition to what they put in the food. Yeah, they just give like because it's free, it's cheap. This is subsidized by the EU. It is for free for the daycares, and so that also explains why this menu is so saturated with this artificially cheap cow's milk. You know. And it is the main beverage, really. Sometimes they offer water or some kind of juice without sugar, but cow's milk is one of the main beverages there. Yeah, so this is an example like that. And I also have another slide of personal experience, which is from this year, February, where I want to show a speciesist socialization in action, how cow's milk consumption is normalized in daycare. So we have in our daycare at least the teachers write summaries of what happens every day and sort of diary and that parents can read. And then I have translated one diary from February 21st this year, which was like this, that the teacher summarizes what they did. So we had conversation with the children on the topic of where does butter come from. And the children said that we get butter from the shop and the food truck brings it. And then we talked about where we get milk products from and what we get from milk. But it's not like actually visible here that they sort of at all, I don't even get from here whether they challenge this, what the children said, that we get butter from the shop, or I don't even know like what they actually said, but this is what they summarized what the children said. And then it goes on. Today we made butter with the children and seasoned it with herbs. The butter turned out soft and tasty. The children could spread the self-made butter on bread, and it seemed that they very much enjoyed eating it. So that was the diary summary of the day that I read that day in February as a vegan parent. And it's not exceptional. This kind of stuff just happens very regularly. Right, okay. And And I want to also point out, and I want to bring in gender again. And so I'm not going to be able to cover in this talk the kind of strategies of vegan parents. We can talk about it in the discussion if somebody's interested to ask. So what do parents do? But one thing that they do is that they try to then pack their own food, you know, to the daycare. I'm one of those parents who does that 3 times a day, 3 meals a day, and to try to replace these milk products and these meat products. And I call it, and this is kind of vegan labor, yeah? And I call it gender, definitely. So as we talk about this, like species socialization is gendered and is speciesist, obviously. And there's feminist work involved in the education system to socialize children into this lactosphere. But yeah, this gender is a really important aspect in vegan parenting that I'm covering in my research as well. And this is to compensate for institutional failures. And this work overwhelmingly falls on vegan mothers. Yeah, it involves a different kind of work, this very physical, practical work of actually dealing with this menus, seeing what needs to be replaced, shopping for the right ingredients, packing everything. It's a lot of work, logistical work, but different kinds of work here actually. Cognitive, emotional labor as well. And so it becomes part of the everyday care and domestic labor of vegan mothers in particular. So imitating that menu in the daycare and cooking for several children. And this has been studied in one research earlier, which vegan labor is actually defined as adopting an alternative diet intensifies parental commitment in a gendered way. So it's a very gendered thing. All right, and now I see actually I'm quite well on time, and I want to just come to my conclusions and just got a few slides on that. So what do we make of all of this? So basically, just to summarize too, some of the things that we can see that the EU has very contradictory commitments. So on the one hand, they've got this climate commitments that they want to be sustainable and contribute to climate mitigation, and they got public health goals. But then again, they are continuing and increasing the consumption, or want to increase the future consumption of cow's milk of citizens and children in particular in the education system. So the agricultural policy, what we see from there are no goals to reduce animal farming or eating animals, despite evidence that we have that climate goals cannot be achieved without moving beyond animal-based food systems. And also I've shown, indicated that capitalist interests of animal farmers and corporations are entangled with institutional speciesism in the EU agricultural policy and subsidies. I've looked at masculinized technofixes, and said basically that this green growth, the green capitalism is an impossible ideal, the EU basically wants to continue current practices, but in a more sustainable way, and so to preserve economic growth. But this is sort of actually not possible. In the EU school fruit, vegetable and milk scheme, cow's milk is presented as universally beneficial and sustainable, as a natural and healthy drink for children. So in this context, it is really hard to contest, cow's milk in school menus, and even to name it as violence against non-human animals. It's really difficult if it is presented in such a way. And this is part of the speciesist and anthropocentric education. This kind of scheme normalizes the consumption of cow's milk through discursive means and material practices. And this is an institutional failure on several fronts. It works against the goals of animal well-being, human health and climate, including the EU's own climate commitments. Got 2 more slides, I think. And so basically what this does is all this happening on the institutional level is hindering individual efforts, and also efforts in institutions like member state level and things like that to move towards plant-based food systems and eating, and of course towards veganism. And it also, because of this, because plant-based milks are not supported under this scheme, it discourages the use of plant-based milks in schools. So it makes it really, it's basically economically unfeasible for caterers to use plant-based milks in these menus. So basically individuals who want to make more ethical, sustainable food choices in these speciesist institutions, they become seen as deviant, and they are positioned as troublemakers asking for exceptions, or they become seen as vegan killjoys, to use Richard Twine's term. And this is how I definitely feel as a vegan parent in that system, that I have to ask for an exception, and you know, I feel even guilty of, you know, making the teachers just deal with that food that I pack and all that. So there's a lot to also analyze here. So more sustainable and ethical food choices are not validated, and they're seen as personal preferences of vegans, not as beneficial for everyone. And it's also really hard for vegan parents in the system to maintain their family's veganism. And there can be issues of social exclusion of vegan children in the education system. And also, as I've argued, that cooking plant-based meals to compensate for institutional failure is a form of vegan labor, which increases gender inequality. And finally, I don't know, of course, we could talk about more practically, so what are the ways forward? There could be many things here, and it's definitely not easy. But of course, we need to have some institutional transformation. Institutions play a crucial role in social change, and individuals can make better choices if institutions enable them to do that. And we need both collective and individual action. But it's of course very difficult to contest some policies and path dependencies of institutions and organizations, particularly when we got these capitalist business interests at play. I think, we need to also think about going beyond just pursuing veganism as an individual lifestyle, but the challenge is institutional resistance to veganism and plant-based diets. Individuals can demand change as well. For instance, you know, vegan parents can demand plant-based meals in educational institutions, but you know, it can be in some contexts more difficult than in others when laws don't enable you to do that very easily. And also vegan and animal advocacy organizations can lobby for change in national nutrition recommendations, things like that. And you know, the way we can frame this is also, I think the sad reality is that these institutions do not care about the well-being of non-human animals, but they care more about issues like equal treatment of people and climate change. So in a way, like maybe strategically, these framings can be used to advance our cause. And I would say also intersectional veganism is really important. So not just, we need to move beyond plant-based capitalism to system change, to use Richard Twine's words. And so in the education system, what I'd like to see is really from plant-based options to really fully vegan education. Because you know, if we can become complacent too if the system just provides us with a plant-based option that doesn't really change or lead us towards like a vegan sort of system or education. So yes, I think we should think about that to move towards really like system change and to challenge plant-based capitalism. Then that's it, I think. Thank you very much.
Kadri, I don't know if you want to prefer to sit here. I will go there just to.
Yeah, whatever works better.
Yeah,
you can come here if you want to.
So we have time. Thank you for also the time-wise. So we have time now for a conversation. So any questions, thought, I don't know, ideas of research. So they are also very welcome always. So any connections? So go ahead. Over there, I see 2 hands. So if you can say your name, maybe just to present yourself so we can hear and get contact with each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have mic? Thank you.
Hi. Hi. Can you hear me? Yes? Is it on? Okay. I can never tell. So I'm Zipporah or Zaza Weisberg. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. It's grim what you've reported, but It's nice to hear that also people are thinking about ways out of that. I was just curious about the feminization, sort of the other coin of the masculinization of the consumption of milk. You were talking about in the critical masculinities research that obviously there's a colonial and racist and gendered, or patriarchal, I should say, agenda there. But it also seems to me that, and I think Tobias Line maybe and others have talked about this, that dairy is promoted as a feminized or feminine product, and particularly in the context of daycare, around sort of daycare being an extension of maternal care in particular. So is that part of the way the EU and then specific member states promote dairy for young people as sort of it's a kind of way of transmitting maternal care? In the yogurt commercials, for some reason, it's always women, right, consuming yogurt. So there's this kind of maternal element and also this something around femininity that we need to be drinking, and ironically, mother's milk ourselves to somehow, of another species, to be fully female.
Thank you very much. It's a really important question. I think because I've been devoting my attention a lot to sort of looking at men and masculinities very critically, so maybe that aspect escaped me. But now that you were saying that, I haven't analyzed that in detail, but definitely I would think like this feminization of dairy, it makes it possible to depict it, I think, as less violent, or maybe not associated with violence towards non-human animals, which also I think enables to promote it to children more easily and in the education system. So it's something something that every child deserves, as we heard, or it's something very nutritious and very natural that children should have or eat. So I think the feminization is actually works as a tool or to maybe achieve these ends. So I think, and you really definitely, I would want to analyze that further, but I agree with you actually. Yes, thank you.
So I saw another hand over there. No? Sorry.
Thanks for this interesting talk, and nice to see you again. I was wondering, have you looked into what we can do against the EU milk scheme? Because I think I remember because I work for the government in Berlin, and they have to allocate money for this. It has to be paid, it's mandatory. And I remember 2 years ago there was a questionnaire from the Commission where we could reply, like citizens could reply, and we were going against this, obviously, because it's unhealthy and it's cruel and all the things you said. What about a citizens' initiative? Would you be willing to, or we all could initiate this? Because I think that's the first thing that's subsidized, and we have to start there maybe as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine. Nice to see you too. This is like one of the trickiest questions, and why also for me, and it seems so bleak, the whole thing, because it seems like it's inevitable almost that this is happening, or what can we as individuals do against these very powerful institutions? And it seems, as you say, like it's all in sort of set policies and laws, and it seems people might feel really disempowered how we can change this. So I think all kinds of such initiatives are really important, as you know, the citizen initiative like that. Also, in some countries, maybe it's easier to do than in others. Estonia is a very small country. So, for instance, the Vegan Society, which actually is a very small organization, has been able to meet with representatives of ministries and even members of the municipality who also like regulate catering in the education system, and to kind of have like to lobby for at least a little bit better policies, or even sort of like some plant-based options. And there's also, it's very limited what they can do, but in some countries, it's when smaller, the countries are smaller, it's a little bit an option that can be done. And yeah, I'm not an expert in sort of policies or how to change policies of transnational organizations, but I think this is one of the most important things. Like we cannot really without changing that milk subsidy, cow's milk subsidy, we cannot really move towards more like plant-based food systems or an education system where we would really have a fully plant-based catering or even vegan education. It's just not possible. So we have to somehow find ways, and I think they can be different ways. So they can be citizen initiatives, as you point out, or lobbying by different national organizations, and also people who are actually in governments themselves, and who maybe on the national level who communicate with the EU regarding these subsidies, for them to speak up. It would be so important. I do not have like one sort of solution. I think it's really tricky, but all kinds of efforts on all levels are very welcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Actually, if I may, about this, because I think it will be just a possibility. I don't know. I didn't. It doesn't come to my mind like asking for a citizenship like initiative, but asking for subsides for vegan menus or vegan plant-based, so the same thing, something like a counter message. I don't know if you heard about this already done. Anybody knows about this? Like asking for a subside for vegans in the place. So, because some of the excuses that not just to counter message at least, right? And also to facilitate that we have vegan menus or vegan options in schools or university or things like that. Because sometimes what they said is it's more expensive to have a vegan options or vegan, even milk, like a plant-based milk. That's what they say, that this is much more expensive. So I don't know if you heard about, because that could be also like, okay, same way that you subside this, maybe we could ask also for some. But again, that reinforces other messages. See, it's like, maybe it's a combination of the two. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that can also be important. I've heard, I don't have quite specific examples, but some vegan groups in some countries have asked for that. You know, let's make possible some plant-based menus by also subsidizing these oat milks or plant-based milks. The thing is, the dairy industries, the cow's milk dairy industries, is so much more powerful. Obviously, like we have some of those, you know, Oatly or some very kind of really small players in the market. Well, they are growing, but still compared to the power of the milk industry. So I think if that strategy is pursued, in any case, we must challenge this cow's milk subsidies and the whole. Support to this animal agriculture. It's part of that. So, and yeah, but I think definitely like we should also look at some kind of more short-term solutions, obviously, because how do we manage otherwise? Mm-hmm.
Over there, thank you.
Hi, so thank you very much for the presentation. It was great information. I wanted to explain a family situation for you to just share your thoughts. As you mentioned, for example, that in the daycare of your son, there are these things happening. An opposite situation happened to me where I learned last year that a family member, he is 10 years old, so going to school, was receiving a full plant-based catering because I guess the school was on board with all the climate framing of the issue. And in this case, the backlash was from parents, like non-vegan parents, that were criticizing that and just framing it as limiting the non-vegan families' options and just like enforcing this ideology, etc. So in cases where this has been possible to have this full vegan or plant-based catering in an education system, how do we balance that we've achieved this, even if it's for climate framings, with the actual reactions of those non-vegan parents? Because perhaps the education has also to be extended to include families in the conversation, because if not, what I was seeing is how these family members were just criticizing that, even though the child was like, oh, I discovered I like vegan nuggets. But the family was like, oh, but we want you to eat freely, etc. So like, even though if at the school these children are getting alternative messages, then at the family place, they are getting the opposite. So how do we balance wanting to achieve this and then just having into consideration that at home the message is going to be different, because the children may be starting their vegan education or a more climate conscious education, but the families are not in that dialogue with the schools. So we need to include them somehow. Like, if you have any thoughts about this, if any examples of this have occurred as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that example. That is very interesting. I think that vegan education, it shouldn't only perhaps be limited to schools and education system and to children, but we need it like as part of citizen education too, in a way, because, obviously I can imagine the instances of resistance from parents, and it's framed as something that, oh, now they are depriving our child of something essential when they are providing these plant-based menus. And as long as we think that veganism is a niche thing, that is just some people, some very strange people choose it as a sort of a lifestyle thing, or and as long as people think that it's not beneficial for everyone, but it's depriving people of something, then I don't think we can, achieve a change. So yeah, definitely, I think the families should be somehow educated. I don't know how, but some sort of citizen education that veganism should be part of. But I also, I think that's what I said. I think, and this is definitely important, I think, to finally move to the fully really plant-based food in education and institutions for, we can emphasize the health, the climate, the animal ethics aspects, all of it, they support each other. So in a way, I feel that in places where we just have plant-based option, that is not enough, because they can make us feel complacent. They have already provided for us an option, but I don't think that it in itself will enable or facilitate a move towards really more fully plant-based or even vegan sort of education system. So I'm a little bit critical of that, providing the option part as well. But you're so right, that the resistance of the families should be analyzed more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes.
Okay, I got the 3 minutes. Here we go. Hi, it's Corey. Hi, Kadri. I'm all the way in the back. Sorry, I would stand up, but I'm covered in stuff. Thank you so much. This is really exciting, and I cannot wait for this book to come out. So just a quick question before I ask the real question. Who's publishing this, and when does it come out?
Oh, thanks for asking. Well, I'm still writing it, and the manuscript is due next August, and the publisher is Emerald in the UK.
All right. Oh, very excited. Some good vegan sociology. So, all right. So I also just reviewed a book, and I wish that I'd known about this project 3 weeks ago, because it would have really helped with my review. There's a book that came out called Expanding the Critical Animal Studies Imagination. It's a Peter Lang publication, Nathan Poirier. He was at our IVAS conference last year. Anyway, there was 3 chapters on there about anti-natalist vegans. So I was waiting on this to come up in the conversation, and it didn't, I guess, because you're focusing on parents. But in the book, they framed it as, this is what vegans do. We are vegans, we're critical vegans, and we know that population is the thing we don't talk about, and so we're anti-natalist, but we don't do it in a bigoted way. We're just anti-pro-natalist is how they framed it. And I wrote in my review, although I don't have kids myself, never will, so I can kind of appeal to both sides. It's a bit strange that they didn't make any space in this edited book for vegan parents, because as far as I'm aware, most of the theorists that I cite who are quite critical have kids. So I was just wondering how you would respond to that, knowing that this book has come out, I think it came out last year, so it's relatively new, and your book is coming out right on top of that. And so there's apparently this whole group of vegan people who think that the true vegan way is to not have kids. So, and especially because now I'm listening to this, it sounds so trying to deal with the school system. How do you do it? Oh, and the last thing is, when I was about 11 or 12, and I'm from Appalachia, we had a hunting class. It was mandatory. Everybody had to take a class to learn how to hunt and deal with how to dress the killed animals and stuff. So, That's all.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks also for mentioning that book. I wasn't aware of that. Definitely interested to read it. Yeah, I've definitely, there's such an approach, and there are definitely vegans and who hold these views that, you know, we shouldn't reproduce and it's very problematic. And I think in some ways to find allies in the vegan community with like concerns over vegan parenting can be difficult in some ways, because there are, I personally know a lot of vegans too who have chosen to remain child-free, which is absolutely okay. So in that sense, I feel like yeah, it would be maybe good to find more allies in that project of vegan, like how do we support vegan parents. And you know, there's surprisingly little written on vegan parenting, actually. And this is when I made my book proposal and started researching what's been done. And I didn't really find, there's almost nothing that included some empirical research with vegan parents themselves. There were just some maybe articles or philosophical discussions like whether and how vegan parents should compromise, which is interesting. So I think that's a necessary perspective, and I think I'm not sure like how much I'll cover this in my book, like to establish dialogue with these anti-natalist perspectives, but I might, and I definitely want to read that book that you mentioned. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you very much. So we are out of time, so let's have a cut. Of course, the conversation can continue with coffee and the rest of the 3 days we have conference. Okay, so thank you very much.